Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dan Macon from UC Cooperative Extension, who covers Placer, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba counties. And Dan is a livestock and natural resource advisor. We have this amazing network of cooperative extension advisors throughout the state. It's a real, we're really very fortunate to be able to have all these resources at the local and county level. And he's going to be giving 2 talks. The first one will be Introduction to Farm and Ranch Economics. So thank you, Dan.
All right. Good to go. All right. And there's my pointer. I'm all set to go, and I think I'm green. Everybody here okay? You guys don't have to sit way in the back. It's kind of like church, you know. When I get to church, I always sit as far away as I can. Welcome, and thank you, Dr. Patesky, for the invitation to be here. I have, for those of you that are watching online, I apologize. I have a face made for radio, I've been told. And hopefully the glare's not too bad off the top of my head. Just to kind of get a sense of who's here, how many of you are already raising poultry here in the room? Or thinking about raising poultry? All right, very good. And I would assume that those of you online are giving it some thought as well. You're taking a really important first step. We have done farm and ranch economic training in Placer and Nevada County now for about 11 years. And we have surveyed folks that have come through our business planning courses and found that it has a huge impact on your profitability to have this kind of training. In Placer and Nevada County, according to the last ag census, about 24% of our producers actually have what the ag census calls positive net returns, what most of us would call profit. So what are the 76% or 75% of those folks doing that aren't making money? We've also found that folks that have gone through these kinds of trainings, about 86% of those folks are making a profit once they're up and running. So it really does have an impact on what you're doing. To give you a little bit more on my background, in addition to being a livestock and natural resources advisor, we have a small-scale sheep operation in the foothills. I must have missed a meeting several years ago and got nominated to be the president of the California Wool Growers Association when I wasn't there. That's kind of how that works, I think. But we've got some skin in the game as well. So it's a part-time business, and I'll try to add some of those examples and experiences in as we go through this. So we're going to start with this first talking a little bit about profit. Talk about kind of the classical economic definition of profit, but more importantly, as a small scale farmer or rancher, what do you use profit for? How many have heard or perhaps said, well, farming is a lifestyle for me? Certainly something I've said, and I've been corrected about that. And we'll talk about what those differences might mean. Talk a little bit about sustainability. And then hopefully before everybody falls asleep, we'll get through this Economics 101, because that's really the gist of what we're going to talk about tonight. And ask questions at any point. I think folks online can ask questions that will be relayed to me. Those of you that are here, please stop me and ask questions if something doesn't make sense. So what is profit? What's it good for? Dave Pratt, who was a farm advisor many years ago and who started a business called the Ranch Management Consultants, says profit is to business as breathing is to life. So it's not the reason any of us farm or ranch, right? But without it, we can't keep going. Just as we don't live just to breathe, but if we don't breathe, we don't live. And so it's really essential to thinking about the long-term sustainability and viability of our businesses. This is a question for you all. What does sustainability mean to you in the context of your agricultural endeavors? What are the elements of sustainability?
To have all your resources around you.
Okay, all right, good. What else? Any other thoughts on sustainability? What do you think of when you hear sustainable farming?
Anything but slash and burn agriculture.
Okay, all right, so conserving resources, right? Okay. I would suggest that maybe there's, at least in my way of looking at it, that there's kind of three generalized elements to sustainable farming. One is that we're farming with the environment, right? We're taking care of those natural resources that are part of our operation. And part of it for me is community, that we're feeding folks in our community, that there's an economic relationship between the community and the farm. But the fundamental foundation of sustainability, I think, if we're talking about these as businesses, has to be the economics. That if the business can't stay in existence, none of the environmental or community benefits continue to exist either. And so we're going to really focus on what that means in terms of the economics at this point. So here's some things that in the course of doing these workshops for 11 years, that ranchers and farmers have told us they use profit for. A lot of folks use profit to reinvest in their business. Farm and ranch businesses can be very capital intensive, and particularly for small scale operations, it may be next to impossible to go out and get a commercial loan. But if you've got profit that you can reinvest in business expansion, that's one way to grow those businesses. I had the experience about 14 years ago now of falling off the stack of hay and landing on both my arms. And having some sort of rainy day fund at a point where I couldn't do work with our sheep was really important in that regard. Anybody here got kids in college or going to college? I've got one that's almost done, thank goodness, and another one about to start. Some farmers want to use profit to support charitable organizations, and that's certainly a valid use. Anybody pronounce that last word on the list? Anybody know what that is? One of the things that we have found in our own business and that we try to help other folks understand is that sometimes you need a little time away from the farm or ranch too. And that's a perfectly legitimate use for profit. So the economic definition of profit, I think, is important because it lays the foundation for what we're going to talk about tonight. So income minus expenses equals profit, right? It's not just that you still have checks in the checkbook, but if you have more income than you have expenses, that's the economic definition of profit. What's another definition of profit? We have somebody here that does cost studies in our presence. What would be a definition of profit? What if your assets at the end of the year or net assets are greater value than at the beginning of the year? A banker would probably consider that a profitable year, right? Because the equity or the value of your business has increased. If you're thinking about this first definition, are all sources of income cash? What's an example of non-cash income to a business?
Labor. Free labor.
That would be an expense, right? How about income? Anybody raise livestock currently? Anybody have a garden currently? Does what you grow in your garden sometimes end up in your own pantry or refrigerator?
Yeah.
That's income, right? But you didn't pay for it. Okay, so they're non-cash sources of income. You mentioned one of the ones on the expense side of the ledger that's huge for small farms. That's unpaid labor. What would be another unpaid expense? Non-cash expense. What if you own your property but don't charge any of your mortgage to the farm business? All right, that would be a non-cash expense. You're not paying that out of the farm. One of the big sources of non-cash income in California would be real estate appreciation. All right, that can be a huge one. So we talked about the increase in net worth. If your net worth at the end of the year is greater than your net worth at the beginning of the year, that could be considered profit. greater equity in the business. This is the definition that Ranching for Profit comes up with, and we're going to hold ourselves to this tonight because it forces us to make some really hard decisions about what we're doing in a farm or ranch business. So from the value that your farm produces, could you pay cash rent for the land? Even if you own it, could you pay yourself cash rent? Could you pay the full cost of the labor? Could you pay interest on all the assets used and cover all the production costs and still have money left over after doing that? That's the definition of profit that we're going to use tonight, because it will really force us to think about these as true businesses rather than as an activity that may generate some income but doesn't really sustain itself over the long term. Any questions about that? Does that make sense to everybody? We're going to make ourselves do a little more work than maybe we've done on our own businesses for a while.
Ken, how do you set your full cost of labor?
That's a great question, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail, but not all labor is of the same value, right? So the days that I build fence, that's probably minimum wage labor in my business. So I ought to charge my business minimum wage for that work. The days that I'm making marketing decisions and deciding what genetics I'm going to use in my sheep operation, that's kind of CEO labor, right? That's higher level management labor. And so maybe I charge $30 or $40 an hour for that labor. So it really depends on the task is the way I look at it. I think for all of our businesses, we kind of got to come to terms with what we value our labor at. There's another way to look at that. We can look at our enterprise and what it generates in terms of profit and figure out how much time we're spending on that enterprise and calculate what our return to our labor is. Sometimes that can be really depressing. We've done pastured poultry on a small scale. We raised 500 broilers about 10 years ago and marketed them through farmers markets. And by the time we counted the labor, mostly in processing and going back and forth to the processor, return to labor was less than minimum wage. So scale becomes an issue in some of those questions too. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
So what if I told you that most farms, small farms and ranches, are subsidized? We hear about agribusiness being subsidized, right? Factory farms being subsidized. How are small farms subsidized?
Tax benefits.
Tax benefits would be one, certainly. Somebody already mentioned one of the major subsidies that most small farms get. Free labor. It's a huge subsidy, right? Huge subsidy. Sometimes we subsidize, particularly in larger scale livestock operations in California, we subsidize those operations off the appreciation of the real estate. If the real estate goes up in value, we can borrow more money just so we can keep ranching, right? That's a huge subsidy. So we're going to hold ourselves to the fact that we don't want any subsidies and we want to use that definition of profit that I put up there. All right, so how do your neighbors stay in business if they're farming? Have they figured out some secret? Anybody had a day like those guys in the tractors? We've all had those days, huh? So how do your neighbors stay in business? What do you suppose they're doing? They figured out a secret? Do you think they value their time? Yeah. So hopefully we're going to give you some tools for looking at your own businesses along these lines. So you don't have to vote yet, but we're going to ask you about lifestyle versus business, okay? So would you prefer, and nobody here probably has this experience. This is not what anybody here would do. Would you prefer a farm or a ranch that requires off-farm income to support farm expenses? Nobody's ever had that experience, I'm sure. I haven't. Is unable to pay the workers a competitive wage, and is unable to pay the owners a competitive wage. I have a story I like to tell when we're talking about labor issues about the visit that we got from the Employment Development Department in our sheep operation. They wanted to look at our employment records, and I said, well, we've got 3 people involved in the sheep ranch. We've got the herder, and the herder makes $15 an hour and a place to live, and here's the records. And the inspector said, that's great. And I said, I've got an irrigator who makes $12 an hour plus a place to live, and here's the records. And he said, great. And I said, we've got a 3rd guy that works in the operation that gets $20 a week and a 5th of Jack Daniels every Friday night. And the inspector said, I need to talk to him. And I said, you are. So we got to pay ourselves a living wage too, right? That we're not doing this just for a hobby. Anybody want to work 70 to 80 hours a week, 52 weeks out of the year? Not a whole lot of fun, probably not sustainable over the long term. And on top of that, you lose money. Does that sound like a lifestyle that would be attractive? Probably not. Or a ranch that can pay competitive wages, provides adequate income to you as the owner, provides a clear path for somebody else to take the business over. You know, many of our farms and ranches are multi-generational, although I have talked to ranchers who've had a hard time passing that responsibility on to the next generation. Where all of the work can be done 10, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, you actually get a day off, and you make a profit. Who votes for option A? Who votes for option B if you're doing this as a business? I would hope that we'd all want to get to option B at some point. Do we always start at option B? Yeah.
You're going to need to change your work hours if the new state laws take it.
Well, if it's the owner, you can work that long. We could have a long conversation about that too. One of the things, and this gets a little bit to your question, Steve, I think there's kind of a difference between owning a business and owning a job. One of the things I like about raising sheep is the work that I get to do with the sheep, right? Lambing time is like 6 weeks of Christmas for us. I love lambing time. That's owning a job. That's owning the job of being a shepherd. Owning a business is doing the things like you're doing here tonight, thinking about how the business operates, thinking about who does what, thinking about profitability. And what we have found in successful farm and ranch businesses that we've worked with is that they spend about 80% of their time working in the business, doing all those things that we like to do outside. So I like to build fence, believe it or not. Moving poultry, planting or harvesting, pruning the fruit trees, irrigating, selling at the farmer's market. Those are all things that are essential to the business, right? But are they setting the long-term direction for the business? We call that WITB or WITB work when we're teaching this short course. But there's also working on the business, and those are the things that we tend to ignore because that's not what drove us to farming or ranching in the first place. How many of you like balancing the checkbook? I hate it. I'm not very good at doing it, but I got to force myself to spend time at it. Doing the kind of short and long-term planning. So I have a partner in the sheep business. Every 6 weeks, we sit down and think about how much grass we've got ahead of us, how many sheep we've got to get to that grass, whether or not we're keeping that system in balance. That's an important short-term planning process for us. Longer term, we sit down once a year and think about where we are in terms of the business, whether we need to expand or contract or change our marketing. This is what all of us love to do, right? Spend time on regulations, but it's a fact of life and what we do. We've got to spend time on it. Telling a regulator, gosh, I didn't know that regulation existed, doesn't get you very far. And so we've all got to spend time on that. Training. You know, whether it's the kind of accounting skills that you need or the kind of physical and production skills that you need. There's a training need in all of this as well. So just go back to that real quick. What we've started trying to get folks to do and what we do in our own business is try to carve out about 20% of our time, maybe 3-4 days a month, where we sit down and think about these kinds of things. Every day, the livestock guardian dogs have to be fed, and the sheep have to be checked, and the fence has to be checked. But a couple of times a month, we need to think about making sure the bills are paid and making sure that our marketing is up to date and making sure that we are regulatory compliant, or we can't continue to do those things we like to do. Any questions about those distinctions? So a couple of notes, and this is, I think, maybe more economic theory than most of us sign up for, but we look at two different kinds of things. We want people to plan for profit, actually to build that into their financial plans. We do two kinds of analyses along those lines. So one is an economic analysis, and that tells us, should I raise sheep or should I raise chickens? What makes the most sense? If I've got a set amount of capital to invest in this business, which of those enterprises makes the most sense? How can I increase profitability? What are the bottlenecks in my business that would allow me to increase profitability if I can address them? And then where are the weak links? So that's the economic analysis. It tells us whether we should do something. Financial analysis tells us how we can accomplish it once we've established that as a goal. So what are our sources and costs of capital? How much interest can we expect to pay? Where's that capital going to come from? Is it our own savings? Are we going to have to take out a loan? Mom and dad going to invest in the business? How's that going to work? Yeah.
How often are you revisiting this economic and financial kind of the assumptions that you're making?
So we do that once a year. So we have done a business plan. I think the initial business plan was done about 10 years ago. But once a year, typically in the late fall, early winter, we'll sit down and review what our goals were in the business plan, and then we'll step back and look at the economics of what we're doing. And so what we might tweak in there, I'll give you an example. When we started in the sheep business, our focus was on selling meat at farmers markets. We did 4 farmers markets a week during the summertime for a couple of years. One winter, we sat down and realized that was taking an awful lot of time away from ranching activities. And so we were paying somebody to do the sheep work and the irrigation so I could be at the farmer's market. And we were also paying somebody to process the lamb. And we stepped back and did the analysis that if we just sold live lambs to Superior when we weaned them in June, we'd actually be money ahead as opposed to going to the farmer's market. But we had to sit down and work through those numbers to understand that. We just didn't make that snap decision. So once a year, we go through that. On the financial analysis, we do a cash flow budget, an annual cash flow budget that's updated on a weekly basis, so we can track income and expenses and kind of where cash is coming in and going out. That also helps, in our business, helps us to schedule specific activities. So, for example, I know we're vaccinating the ewes for their pre-lambing vaccine this Saturday. Now I've got a reminder in my calendar 2 weeks ahead of that I've got to order vaccine and syringes and needles so I don't show up Saturday morning and think, what are we going to do? But it's a way to kind of remind ourselves both of the financial aspects of that and of the other work involved. Does this difference make sense to folks? Because they're both really important. Knowing if you should do something is just as important as knowing how you'll accomplish it once you've decided to do it. So a couple of terms that we need to get through so we can kind of think about this together. Gross product is a term that we use to incorporate sales. It incorporates changes in inventory. So if you are selling broilers, for example, and you've harvested a bunch of broilers, but you haven't sold them yet, that inventory has value, right? So we incorporate that. We incorporate direct costs. Some of you may have heard the term variable costs, but we use the term direct, and those are expenses that vary with the number of units produced, okay? So what would be an example in the chicken business of an expense that varies with the number of chickens that you have? Feed is a huge one, right? 1 unit of feed per 1 bird, 2 units of feed per 2 birds. So feed's a huge one. And then overhead costs, what some people call fixed costs, are those things that don't vary with the units of production. What would be something that, a cost that does not vary with your unit of production?
The chicken coop.
So capital to some extent, yep. What's another one that's related to that? Yep, yep. Doesn't matter how many chickens you have, you got to pay for that environment control, right? So an example in our business is livestock guardian dogs. The dog has to be fed whether he's protecting 1 ewe or 500 ewes, right? So we really divide, excuse me, those overhead costs into land and labor, essentially. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in livestock terms. So those are relatively fixed. I mean, if you're expanding your operation and you need more land, your land cost isn't going to be fixed, but it stair steps up. So in terms of the equation here, we take our gross product, so the sales and the changes in inventory, and we subtract our direct costs. Whoop, go the right way. We also use something called opportunity costs. So without getting into the weeds on this, one of the things that we look at every year is whether we should take the money we've invested in the sheep business and keep it in sheep. And there's an opportunity cost to doing that. So for example, the value of our ewe flock right now is probably $25,000. We could take that $25,000 and invest it in something else and get interest on that investment. And that's the opportunity that we're giving up to stay in the sheep business. Does that make sense to everybody? Every year we can make that decision. And what opportunity cost allows us to do is to compare what we're doing this year with other opportunities that might be out there for using that capital. So we subtract those costs, and that gives us what we call our gross margin, okay? And if you've had to sit through economics classes in college like I did, you got tired of hearing about gross margin and whether or not you should do something depending on the gross margin. Then we subtract our overhead costs. What do you suppose we get after we subtract overhead costs from gross margin? What's that word? Profit. Excellent. Hopefully it's profit, right? Hopefully it's not that L word. That L word is nasty. We hate that L word. How many of you go, if you've been around farmers or ranchers, how many of you ask people how many sheep they run or how many cows they run? Something those of us in agriculture all have been taught not to do, right? It's like asking somebody, how much money's in your savings account? So when we talk to other folks, we don't actually ask them what their profit or loss is, but we ask them about these benchmarks. And these are the standards we're going to kind of hold our own businesses to. So we want our gross margin to be 70% of our gross product. That means for every dollar that I get in selling sheep, after I pay all those direct costs, I want to keep 70 cents. That's my goal, okay? And I can compare my small business with Amy Livestock down the road in Rio Vista, who's running 5,000 ewes maybe, and we can look at those benchmarks without getting into the weeds about the dollar figures. Overhead costs should be around 50% of our total gross product, which means our profit benchmark is around 20%, okay? And we don't always achieve that in our business every year, but it gives us a way to look at what should we tweak to achieve those benchmarks in the year to come. Does this make sense to folks? Any questions about this framework? We'll talk about it in a little more detail here in just a second. All right, so gross product in livestock or poultry, for us, it's live lamb sales, it's cull use sales, it's cull ram sales, and it's wool sales. And there may be some miscellaneous income. If you're raising meat birds, it's going to be poultry sales. Anybody thought about selling live poultry as opposed to meat? Now, there's a couple of auctions where you can sell live poultry still. It could be meat in inventory, could be broilers that, chicks that you bought that are in process. A variety of things go into gross product. For direct costs, supplemental feed is the big one. Vaccines and medications. So if you've got to give vaccines, one dose of vaccine per every animal that you're raising. Any kind of identification costs, so leg bands or ear tags, things like that. And then we include marketing costs in there too. If you're paying a commission, you sell one animal, you're paying 1 times the commission. You sell 2, you're paying 2 times the commission. One of the differences between vegetables and crops versus livestock is that we do include our production labor as a direct cost. If you're growing 100 feet of bed of one particular vegetable, you've got 100 units of labor required for that bed, as opposed to it takes me the same amount of time to build fence for 5 sheep as it does to build fence for 100 sheep. So that labor is an overhead. So in overheads, we talked about it being land or labor. For us, our land rent, our irrigation water, because that allows us to grow more feed. Doesn't matter how many sheep we've got, we got to pay the water bill. Our labor, our guardian and herding dogs, which are a component of labor, right? My labor's much more efficient using a border collie than it would be using myself to gather sheep. Horses, equipment repair and maintenance, depreciation. You'll notice that I didn't put things like coops or equipment on here because that's a capital cost. But the cost of maintaining those pieces of equipment, the repair costs and the depreciation are fixed costs. Does this make sense to everybody in terms of the framework of thinking about your expenses? Okay. So now that we're all economic experts, we're going to go into the chicken business together, okay? You guys all ready to be partners in the poultry business? We have a couple of constraints on us. We're going to do pastured broilers because we think that's where the opportunity is. But we have a couple of constraints that we're going to have to deal with, okay? We have no money, okay? We have no time. We all work in town, so there's no time that we can contribute to it. And we have no land. You guys ready to go into business together? What do these assumptions suggest? We have no money. What does that mean? We had to get a loan. Is the bank going to give it to us for free?
No.
No, probably not. Most banks won't. We have no time. What does that mean? Got to hire somebody, right? So we got to get labor there. And we have no land. So what does that mean? We got to lease it. Exactly. All right. So we're farming now, right? So what are all those things? The cost of money, the cost of labor, the cost of land. Are those overheads or fixed or direct costs? Overheads. All right. So we're going to need borrowed money. You guys already got all this part. I should have changed that to take care of the chickens. So those are overhead costs. No matter how many chickens we're running, we incur those, okay? So there's our cost. We've just spent that much money. We haven't even bought any chickens yet, but we've got that overhead cost incurred. All right? Now, we have chickens turned out. We bought chicks. We got them out there. Do we have any expenses now that we have live animals on the farm? What would those costs be? Feed, water, absolutely. All those things that vary with the number of units. So we got to buy feed and we got to have some vet. I had the good fortune of marrying my veterinarian It does not I can attest to the fact it does not reduce your vet costs, but I can almost always find her in an emergency. We've got livestock ID costs. We may have some marketing costs eventually. What are those things called? Are those direct costs or overhead? Direct costs, right? All right. So now, in addition to those overheads, we've got this other cost line that varies with the units of production, right? Okay. And now, 6 to 8 weeks go by, we've sold a chicken. Look at that. Doesn't that look like a great business? We've sold something. That's awesome. What do we need to do? This is really a business.
Find a buyer.
We got to sell more, right? All right, so that is our income line. That blue line is our income or our gross product, okay? Now, this is the geometry portion of the test. How many like that break-even point? If you had a business that was breaking even, would you be happy?
No.
As my friend Roger Ingram says, break even sucks. You want to get past break even as quickly as you can, right? So what's that red zone called? What do we call that economically?
Not revenue.
Remember that equation that I showed about gross product minus direct costs minus overhead? Down at the bottom, there were two words. Is this the P word or the L word in red? That's loss, right? That's right. How about that? Profit. Do we like to be in the red or the green? Green is where we want to be. It's where we want to live, okay? So what this tells us is that there's a couple of things we can troubleshoot in our businesses, okay? This very simple analysis, and you can map it out on a graph, or we do it in terms of a spreadsheet with our budget every year. We can look at what we need to do to improve profitability. So one thing we can do is reduce overhead. How can we reduce overhead? What are the two components of overhead? Land and labor, right? So what can we do to reduce the cost of our labor? But we're going to pay ourselves. We're going to hold ourselves to that standard. What is one way that we make our own labor more cost effective?
Greater efficiency.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I started in the sheep business, it took me half a day to load 5 ewes in the trailer because I didn't know what I was doing. Today, we can load a semi in 45 minutes if we have to. So my labor became more efficient, right? Didn't necessarily pay myself any less, but I got more done in the same amount of time. How would we make the cost of land decline?
Find a better lease.
Find a better lease. How else might we do it? So we talked about irrigation. If you're doing something with irrigation being part of the land cost, how might you make that a lower cost? Is water getting cheaper in California? No.
Find a list that has its own level of free.
Okay, so find a different source of water. What if we are more efficient in our use of water? Yeah. So for us, what water use efficiency has meant, in the foothills, we still buy water like the old mining companies bought water. So we buy it by the miner's inch. We buy the same amount of water, but we've invested in technology that puts it over more land. So that's made us more efficient, okay? So if we can reduce our overhead for the same number of birds that we're selling or sheep that we're selling, we can increase profit, right? So that we're at the same number of birds that we sold before at break even, but now we're achieving a profit. Okay, the other thing we can do is improve gross margin per unit. What are the two components of gross margin? We have sales, right? And we subtract those direct costs. So how do we improve that? We can increase what we're charging for what we're selling, right? What's the other way we can improve gross margin? We'll talk about that one in just a sec. We can reduce our direct costs, right? But if we just focus on reducing direct costs, do the chickens perform as well if we just buy less feed or cheaper feed? No. So we want to look at that gross margin per unit. We want to look at the relationship between how many birds or how many sheep we're raising and those direct costs. So one of the ways in the poultry business we might be able to reduce or improve that gross margin per unit is to buy feed in bulk versus buying feed in sacks at the feed store, right? We get a discount on that. Does that come with other costs?
Storage.
Yep. Wastage, yep. Transportation, yep. And so what we've got to do is work through all of those actual numbers and figure out what makes the most sense. Give you an example in our business along those lines. With sheep, one of the things that we do is what's called flushing prior to breeding. So we try to put the ewes on a higher plane of nutrition for about 2 to 3 weeks before the rams go in. And that makes their reproductive systems think, wow, we're in really flush times, we can produce more eggs, and ultimately produce more lambs. We had been buying bulk feed, having to go up to Artoy actually to buy bulk feed. By the time I counted my time driving up there and back, renting a trailer and finding a way to store that bulk feed, we realized this year it was cheaper for us to buy bagged feed. But we had to have those numbers put together to figure out what made the most sense in our system. Any questions about that? What if you decided you were just going to cut out all veterinary costs? Would that be a good way to increase gross margin per unit? Probably not.
Until they die.
Looks really good for a little while, huh? All right, so they're at the same level of production, we've got profit as opposed to break even. This is what you said, increasing turnover. And there's a couple of ways to think about increasing turnover. One is to raise our prices. Is there a limit to what people will pay? Absolutely. One of the realizations that I had when we started doing lamb was that people probably were not going to pay $75 for a leg of lamb except at Christmas time. Right? So there's an upper limit to that. When we were selling poultry, we got, I think the highest we charged was $3.50 a pound, and that was some time ago. We found in Auburn, we couldn't charge more than that. In the Bay Area, you can achieve higher prices than that. What's another way to increase turnover? So let's say you buy 100-day-old broiler chicks. Okay. Now, when you take them into the processor, you've got 75 chicks that made it. So if you deal with mortality rates, you can increase turnover, right? One of the ways we increase turnover in the sheep business is to increase our twinning percentage. Same number of ewes, more saleable units out of that same number of ewes. Okay. With chickens, maybe you turn over those batches of chicks more frequently, right? Maybe you buy them every week instead of every 2 weeks. And we can walk through, once we got the fundamentals down on your economics, we can walk through which of these three approaches have the greatest impact on profitability. But the first step is to collect all of those numbers that you need on your own production system so that we can then look at it. One of the things that's really interesting in the 6-week course that we do, the third Saturday, we spend all day helping people enter their actual financial records into this model. And by the end of the day, they get to the point where they're so totally depressed that they're losing so much money, they don't know that they want to go on. But the next session, we go through these 3 troubleshooting ideas, and we start to figure out where their particular issues are. And it's almost invariable that the light comes on and folks start thinking, wow, if I just change my overhead structure, or if I invest in becoming more efficient in my labor, that solves one of my issues. So there's a lot of power in finding out where your weak spots are and where your bottlenecks are. Any questions on this? I think that's about it for the first talk. Any questions or experiences that you've all had in any of you run other businesses of your own? Good. What kind of business do you do?
I have a nail salon.
Okay. So these principles are very, the things that you're selling are different, right? But you have direct costs, right? You have overhead, and hopefully you have sales.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about a contract? How far do you get into?
So, a lot of the folks that we work with are focused on direct market. There is some contracting with restaurants. Yeah, or with direct to retail. And those can be useful in terms of getting some upfront commitment. One of the challenges that folks have found in working with restaurants in particular is the terms by which they pay. So they may pay in 30 days or 45 days, and you've already expended all that money to get those birds raised and processed. Or, this is probably a shock to everybody, restaurants sometimes don't stay in business. We have a producer that has done pastured pork and pastured poultry up in Nevada County that took 9 months to get paid for 3 hogs that they delivered to a restaurant. So those kinds of things, in terms of having a contract written with some, yeah. There are, in the sheep world, Superior Farms, which is our big processor here in California, will actually front money for people that want to expand their sheep operations for a 5-year commitment to sell all their lambs to Superior. And there's been some folks that have gotten a pretty good start that way, if you've got the land to do it. Yeah.
So you might have said this, but did the Superior model for you work better than the farmer's market model 6 months ago?
Yeah, so give you a little kind of the Cliff Notes version of the history of our business. We started off, as I said, focused on farmers markets. In 2013, we moved all of our sheep to Rio Vista, and I worked part-time, half-time for a large sheep operation in Rio Vista. So we ran our sheep with theirs. Anybody remember what the fall of 2013 and the winter of 2014 were like in California? Didn't rain for 60 days. We fed all of the alfalfa at that ranch that they'd put up for the whole year between October 1st and New Year's Day. And so at that point, we sold about 2/3 of the sheep just because we didn't have forage for them. And we transitioned to selling to Superior rather than spending time at farmers market. And what we found is that those benchmarks that I went through, let's see, here they are, that our benchmarks were much more favorable. We were able to achieve that 70% gross margin selling directly to Superior. One of the analyses that we did, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, how many of you are thinking about value-added products or know what a value-added product is? It's where we change the USDA says it's changing the form of the product. An economist would tell you it actually has to add value to be value-added. But what we started doing is looking at our business as if the production business that produced a live lamb was selling that live lamb either to Superior or to my meat business. And if it sold it to my meat business, the meat business had to pay for the value of the live lamb, plus the processing cost, plus the cost of my time being at a farmer's market, plus the storage cost for that meat product. And yeah, maybe it added $50 a head to the value of that lamb, but I also had to spend an additional $200 per head to get it put into a plastic bag in a form I could sell it at the farmer's market. And so it's our benchmark on the meat, our gross margin benchmark on the meat business never got better than 40% if we held ourselves to that analysis. So I was spending 60 cents out of every dollar that the meat business brought in to buy the lamb, pay for the processing and all of that. And so I was better off just selling that live lamb.
So can you sketch out a practical scenario where that wouldn't, where it would pencil out for you to process it yourself?
Yeah, there are some opportunities now with cattle, and we're hoping to change it for small ruminants where you can do on-ranch slaughter and sell the meat to an end user. You know, there is this poultry exemption that exists, and it'd be similar to that. In that case, there would be lower costs in terms of the processing cost. I think the challenge is building enough volume of customers that want to buy whole and half animals that have the ability to store that.
So you're saying it's a regulatory kind of
Yep.
issue?
Yep.
Is that unique to California, or is that?
It is, other states have state inspected slaughter facilities that facilitate within state lines the direct sale of meat. And we kind of gave up that system, I think, in the first Brown administration. But we're bringing that back. There was a new law passed last year for cattle that allows that again. And we're hoping to get that changed for small ruminants too. So, Steve.
Segue into that. In your neighborhood there out of Lincoln, there was at one time a mobile poultry process.
Yes. Yep.
And I haven't seen hide nor hair of it for 8 years, maybe. Is that still an option? And has there been any economic analysis on that being done?
It still is an option. And so we got some grant money up there, gosh, it's been probably 10 or 12 years ago, to build a mobile slaughter unit. And we finally got both counties to accept that as something that people could use and take poultry to the farmer's market. You couldn't sell to restaurants, but you could sell directly to the end user if you use that. And it still is in use, not getting a whole lot of use. One of the issues that we discovered with that is that anybody been to New American Poultry over in Rancho Cordova? So there, you can take a load of birds in there, go have breakfast, come back, and you've got an ice chest full of processed birds, right? They're really efficient labor-wise. I'm not very efficient labor-wise. And we did, I think the most we did in that unit ourselves was 75 birds in one day, and it took us all day. And so that kind of labor for us, because I don't do it every day, I was very inefficient. I think that's the issue with kind of those self-service systems that make them difficult. There is a mobile slaughter unit that is actually parked permanently for large animals, large livestock down on the Central Coast. And they found it to be an issue in terms of throughput and volume. Macy, was there a question?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. The online people aren't able to hear the audience questions.
Oh, shoot, you told me that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Repeat what questions we hear, but a lady has a question. Can you give us an example of the 70% benchmark for gross margin and the 50% for overhead costs, and how do you calculate that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm sorry I haven't been repeating questions. I was told to do that, and I obviously don't take instruction very well. So the way that we would calculate that, well, let's just use an example of our sheep business. Let's say that we sell $10,000 worth of lambs, okay? That's our gross product. And then we go out and buy supplemental feed, we buy minerals, we buy vaccines, we buy ear tags, And all of that, all of our direct costs come to $3,000 total, right? Is there a whiteboard in here that we can use?
Behind the screen.
Oh, okay, okay. We'll work through this. So we spend $3,000 on those direct costs. So our gross margin then is what? If we took 10,000 in, spent 3,000, so we've got $7,000 in gross margin. That's our 70% benchmark, okay? So then we've got $7,000 that we've generated after we paid those direct costs. Then let's say we've got to pay ourselves as the laborer. We've got to pay rent for the land, and we've got to pay water costs, okay? And that comes to $5,000 total, right? So our overhead percentage, that benchmark, is 50% of our gross product. For every dollar we took in gross product, we spent 50 cents on overhead. So we've got $7,000 in gross margin, right? We spent $5,000 in overhead. What's our profit? That's our 20% benchmark on profit, okay? Does that make sense? So we actually, at the end of the year, put all of our financial records into that format and see how we did. Last year, our gross margin ratio was about 64%. We didn't do quite as well as we thought we would. Part of that is because all of our wool clip is still sitting in a warehouse unsold, so we haven't recognized any revenue from our wool.
But you have the expense of the shearing.
We still paid for shearing and the wool sacks and all of that, yep. Yep. Fortunately, we don't have to pay storage. The broker that hasn't sold our wool yet is storing it for us. Any other questions? Yes?
Just one thing for the farmer's market, really important you have to understand too, is that it's a rainy day, nobody's going to show up.
You know what, for the most part that was true. What was really interesting is if I took nothing but stew meat on a rainy day, I had a great day at the market. But it depended on the market. So we went to, that's a great illustration. We went in the wintertime, we went to the Auburn Farmers Market on a Saturday and the Roseville Farmers Market on a Tuesday. Auburn Farmers Market's in the center of Old Town. It's a place where people come whether they're buying anything or not because they want to visit. The Roseville Farmers Market's in the Whole Foods parking lot. And when Whole Foods started running specials on lamb on Farmers Market Day, I knew that rainy days were not going to be real successful in Roseville. But that's very true. Or sometimes it will happen that Davis Scott has a permanent farmers market, which is great. We had to put easy ups up, and if the market manager thought we were going to get 30-mile-an-hour winds, the market got canceled just because of a liability of having those easy ups blowing all over the place. So that's a great point in terms of marketing. What happens if you've got stuff that you need to sell that week and the market shuts down? How do you handle that? Freezer if you were doing meat, right? So we can store that way. What if you've got a perishable product?
Food bank.
Food bank could be one.
Have some of your frequent buyers information so you can call them and ask, hey, can I deliver this?
Absolutely, having restaurants that will take stuff. So another example from the lamb business, the first batch of lambs that we harvested to sell at farmers market, we took to a USDA processor in Stockton. And they were, up until the time I went to pick up the meat, great to work with. But I got there and they had all of our meat in boxes with no labels. And environmental health said you got to have a label with the weight, the price, and the inspection bug on every cut of meat in order to sell at the farmer's market. So what do you do in that case? So we had several restaurants that were willing to try lamb, but we had to make some pretty frantic phone calls to make that happen. And that's kind of the reality of direct marketing, right? Those things happen to all of us. And I didn't ask repeat the question. The point was that if it rains at a farmer's market, you won't have any customers, and that can be very true. Anything else? Do we want to take a little break, or are we going to shift right into the next talk?
Take a 5-minute break if you want to announce it.
Okay, so we're going to take about a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and do a shorter talk on some economic marketing principles. So take a break. Thank you.
No worries. That was great.
The guy in Fairfield that had a license to sell lives. She didn't want to.
Yeah.
He didn't want what it cost him.
There were some people. They lost.
He would sell him. But yeah, that's what I did. I was working here.
There we go. All right. All right, I think we're back on. This is a much shorter set of slides that we'll run through pretty quick. It's kind of the Dan Macon version of the top 10 list, if you remember David Letterman. But one of the things I want to start with is I was trained here as an ag economist a long time ago. I actually had hair when I was here as a student. But if you put all of the agricultural economists in the world end to end, we still wouldn't reach a conclusion. So you can ask an ag economist, a panel of ag economists, the same question, and everybody will have a different answer for you. So take what I say here with a grain of salt. These are some things that kind of developed over the course of time teaching these classes, but also trying to farm and ranch myself. I think it's really important to start with the end in mind. You know, you're not going to get there the day you open the farm, but start with what your goal is in terms of that profit or what it needs to pay you, because that gives you some framework for evaluating some of those financial decisions. I think it's also really important, we just talked a little bit about this, identify the core business or enterprise that generates the greatest profit. That's something that takes some time to develop, I think. One of the things we tell vegetable growers that come through this class is, it's great if you want to try 70 or 80 varieties of vegetables. Grow those in your garden. Figure out what you can sell at a profit and focus on those. And this gets to that as well. A lot of people will talk about, well, diversity is my way of managing risk. If one crop fails, I've got something else that made it, right? But if you got to change, if you're growing vegetables and you've got to change the implement on the tractor every 100 feet because you've got a different crop growing there, that's probably not a terribly efficient system. We tried running goats with sheep. I found after about 6 months that I'm a sheep man. Goats just annoyed me after a while, and they were always out. And so that was the kind of focus lesson that I needed. Really important to know your numbers, okay? It's important not only for your own business, but it's important as a part of the agricultural community. And I'll give an example of this. Person that used to work for Placer County. Placer County is known for mandarin orange production, okay? Foothill mandarin oranges. This guy that worked for the county decided when he retired that he was going to put in 5 acres of mandarins. It's a pretty good sized orchard in our county. And I asked him what he was going to sell them for the first year he had a crop. And he said, you know, $1 a pound. I don't really care. It's just something for my grandkids to do. I have another friend that has 20 acres of mandarins who's trying to put 2 kids through college selling mandarins. And selling at $1 a pound put downward pressure on his price, right? So it's not that we need to collude on our prices. It's that if you know I've done my homework and I know you've done your homework, and we're selling at a level that we think for our own business is profitable, then we've got that level playing field. That's part of being in an agricultural community. It's kind of like the last half hour of the farmer's market used to really tick me off if people would cut their prices the last half hour of the farmer's market, right? Part of that example. One of the things that we've done, instead of diversifying and trying to grow every kind of livestock imaginable or every crop imaginable, is look for additional revenue streams from what we do well. So for an example, sheep, we raise ewes, they produce a lamb, maybe 2 lambs every year. They produce wool every year. We can sell meat. We can sell targeted grazing. We can sell call ewes to people that want to train their border collies. I mean, there's all sorts of different avenues that we can generate revenue from that core asset. But it pays to sit down and think about what those other revenue streams might be. Fertility with poultry, I think, would be one that has some value potentially. I think sorry, this is cut off. We started small, so we made small mistakes that didn't hurt too bad. But we also realized that if we stayed small, that we were never going to get where we needed to be. And the worst possible place to be is to have full-time work and a part-time income from your farming operation. We got to the point where we could do the work on our operation on a part-time basis for a part-time income. And that was the decision that we made. Before the drought, our focus was on getting big enough to generate a full-time income. And so the drought hampered those plans. But staying in that middle ground is really tough economically.
Dan?
Yes.
Along those lines, what I've found is if you're going to make mistakes, make them quickly also.
Yeah, the statement was, if you're going to make mistakes, make them quickly. And learn from them, right? I think that's part of it too. If you make the same mistake twice, you probably didn't learn the first time. And sometimes it's taken me 3 or 4 times to figure that out. But make those mistakes a learning opportunity. Part of that for me is to write down what I've done so I can go back to it and look at what that mistake was. This is a big one, I think, for direct market. But also, we no longer really direct market, and this is an issue for us. So there's a story that goes with our production. Our story is that we raise grass-fed lambs on foothill rangelands, that we don't use lethal control on predators because we use guard dogs and electric fence. That's all an important part of our story and was really important when we sold at the farmer's market. But unless that lamb chop that somebody bought was the best lamb chop they'd ever eaten, that story had no value at all. And so I think starting out, one of the things that we've learned from other folks is that work on your production system. Learn how to produce what it is you think you want to sell. Don't take a bad product to the market. Know what your quality is too, because that's going to hamper your long-term access to that market. If that makes sense. We talked about this before. Value-added products must add value beyond the cost of converting the product to another form. About probably 50% of the folks that come to our beginning farming class know they want to grow tomatoes and know that the way to make money growing tomatoes is to turn them into salsa. How many local salsa producers do you think we have in our farmers market? 0. It's one thing to go through all the regulatory process and the permitting process to do that value added. It's another thing to actually add value to those tomatoes. So on the flip side of that, one of the things that we did successfully when we were doing farmers markets, and I wish we still had access to this market, anybody that has sheep knows that when you take a cull ewe to the Escalon sales yard or to Stockton, you get about $25 or $30 a head for her. Doesn't hardly pay the fuel to take her to the sale, right? I started having cull ewes cut up into 2 by 2 inch cubes with bone in and selling them at the farmer's market as pet food. And then about 3 weeks in, somebody came and said, God, that pet food made the best mutton curry I've ever had in my life. So we doubled the price and sold it as mutton stew. And those $30 ewes then became worth about $250 a piece while we could get the processing done effectively. But that added value to the product, right? I think this is a hard one for all of us. If an enterprise is losing money, anybody heard the term loss leader? Well, I just do that to get people to come into the stall, right? If you're selling at a farmer's market. If you've got an enterprise as a small farm that's losing money, fix it or lose it. And it's hard to let go of some of those things. We did eggs on a small scale at our farmer's market. And I sat down and looked at whether 50 chickens made sense to have eggs in our stall at the farmer's market, and it did not. And we weren't at a point where we wanted to get bigger with that business. And so we dropped that enterprise and freed up that time to do things that actually made us a return. That's the other piece of dropping those enterprises that aren't profitable. I think the last thing, and this is maybe a foothill thing primarily, but we get a lot of folks that really want to come and be part of the agricultural community, want to be part of the farm community. And the best way to be engaged in the farm community is for other farmers to know that you're taking your business seriously as a business. To know that it's moved beyond the hobby stage or the backyard stage. It can be very small, but if you're taking it seriously as a business, I think that's a really important component to it as well. These are my 5 stages of small farm evolution. We went through these. I think most of the farms that I've worked with have gone through these. When we bought our place in Auburn in 2001, I read all the Joel Salatin books. I read Gene Logston. I still read Wendell Berry whenever I get a chance. But boy, this was how we wanted to raise our kids. We had a 3-year-old and we're expecting another, and that was the dream of it. You know, we were going to raise vegetables, and I'm trying to think, our first 5 years to the farmer's market, we raised spring vegetables, summer vegetables, fall vegetables. We did firewood, we did custom milled lumber, we did meat birds, we did eggs. We ran cows for other people, we ran goats, we ran our own sheep. We did free range Christmas trees at the farmer's market. It was a pretty romantic life. That's why I don't have any hair left.
Was it hard keeping track of them free range trees?
It was really hard keeping track of the free range. We actually had a customer that wanted a manzanita Christmas tree every year. We were the only place that would give him a manzanita Christmas tree. But then you get to a point where you're starting to figure out what you're good at and experiment with what you're doing. And we went through that. So we experimented with running sheep and goats together. We experimented with doing pastured broilers because we thought maybe there was some opportunity there. And that's natural in any farm business, I think, that experimentation phase. Probably about 2010, we got to stage number 3, where we realized that all of that experimentation and all of those varied crops was costing us a lot of money, and that maybe growing 100 feet of this and 20 feet of that was not an effective use of our resources and time. But we also realized at that point that we were pretty good at raising sheep, and that there was a market for taking our sheep to places like Rockland and Lincoln and Roseville and getting paid to put them on other people's grass. And so we started looking at ways to expand that. I actually get to this point every year about 3 weeks before irrigation water shuts off, where I start thinking, what the heck am I doing? I've been getting up at 4:30 every morning and going to move water before I go into my real job. And then I come back in the afternoon and move sheep, and is this really worth it? But I think every farm goes through that evolution too. Why are we still doing this? And then I think we came to the point where we realized that we could have a viable part-time business that would generate a part-time income for us, that would allow us to do some other things with sheep that we wanted to do, and would also give us time to do things away from the ranch. And that's kind of where we are now. But I don't know that I could have I don't think I could have short-circuited that. I think I had to go through each of those 5 stages to get to where we are today. I think the trick is to get from 1 to 5 as quickly as possible, and maybe not to entirely lose sight of number 1, that's part of why all of us do what we do, that we love. For me, I love working with animals and working outdoors, and that's part of it as well. So the bottom line is that if you're thinking about doing this, the only way to start is to actually get something in the ground, or get chickens bought, or buy sheep, or do something, whether it's small or large, and start learning from those mistakes that we talked about, Steve. You're not going to make any mistakes if you haven't done anything, right? And that's part of it too, is to start that process. So with that, are there any questions about the top 10 list or about the evolution? Maurice?
Not on the top 10 list, but I'm wondering, since you're a farmer and a advisor who kind of looks at this from 2 different kind of perspectives, I'm wondering if you can kind of comment just on the geography of success. Is it regional? Is it, I mean, you obviously go to national meetings. Do you hear all the same kind of arguments and chatter in national meetings? And is there a sweet spot as far as where people you think are potentially more successful where they're starting with that scenario you sketched out with no money?
So the question is there geographic differences in the levels of success that people are achieving? And to some extent, anybody see the Small Farmers Journal? It's a neat publication about horse farming. There was a question in there many years ago that they asked their readership, where's the best place to farm? And I think there are some sweet spots in terms of proximity to markets and availability and affordability of land. I think there are parts of the foothills that have some pretty positive attributes in that regard. I'm not real familiar with this part of the world, but I would suspect that there's places like Capay Valley, the north end of the Sacramento Valley, that may be close enough to transportation corridors to make access to those markets viable. I think the kind of the short flip answer is the best place to farm is wherever you can start. And I think for us, to not that this is a particular model to follow, we own 3 acres. We ranch on a total of about 400 acres, only 20 of which do we pay for. And those opportunities do exist in places like Auburn and Grass Valley and Placerville. And, there are some opportunities. Those come with complications. When the 10 landowners where we are grazing for summer fuel load reduction all want to talk the day I go out there and have 5 minutes to feed guard dogs, you talk with those 15, 20 landowners because they're the folks that own the land. But I think there are opportunities to get started and to expand without increasing those overhead costs.
And I guess the reason I asked that is because, just looking at it from the outside in, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the 2 most important kind of variables that I would need to kind of assess, kind of in your pre-farm evaluation, would be market opportunity, and then the most expensive cost would be land.
Yes. Yeah, so the point is that kind of the 2 things that you want to analyze early on is the market opportunity and the cost of land. One of the things that I think is really important is to know who's going to buy what you're producing before it goes in the ground or before you've bought chickens or anything like that, to have an idea where that's going. We have, for our sheep business, we have a pretty good ethnic market for small lambs. We also have a good market for people that want to raise their own lambs. As soon as I know how many lambs are on the ground at the end of March, I start making those contacts, and they're sold before they're weaned from their mothers. So I think that is a good point. You had a point to make.
Back to your question about locales for successful farming, Northern California is the hot spot for small farming in the U.S. I deal with one of the major national brands, and Northern California is unique to the rest of the country.
And so the point was that Northern California is unique to the rest of the country. Is that access to markets?
Access to market, people want to buy from the small farm.
Yep. And I think it's kind of a double-edged knife, and apparently we need to pay the electric bill. Actually, it was the public safety power shut off, I think. I think it's a double-edged knife, right? We live in the most populous state in the country, which there are times when I'm trying to pull a gooseneck through downtown or through Sacramento that feels like a real pain in the neck. But that's also access to markets. And I think Sacramento Valley is kind of the best of both worlds in that regard. Yes, online question?
Yeah, what resources or people do you use when you ran into trouble and needed help? And did you grow up farming?
Good questions, both. So I will put a plug in for the system that I work for. I think, repeat the question.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you. Question is, where do you turn for resources? And did I grow up farming? So resources, University of California Cooperative Extension has locally based farm advisors in just about every county by discipline area. We've got specialists here on campus in the vet school as well as in the other departments that can be extremely helpful in that regard. And most of the farm advisors work with specialists on those particular questions. I did not grow up farming. The farming gene skipped a couple of skipped a couple of generations in my family. Always had animals around, but we decided about 2004 to try to do it commercially. And we're still trying to figure it out. It's a lifetime process. Any other questions? Yeah.
Have you ever looked at brokerage, using brokers?
The question is, have I ever looked at using brokers? So we actually do in a couple of cases. So we'll probably change brokers because our wool broker tends to lose track of our wool clip almost every year. And we have to call him and have him track it down, which is rather annoying. And this year it has not sold yet. The guy that buys the bulk of our lambs actually has developed a significant ethnic market in the Bay Area for small lambs. So he'll sell a lot of whole carcass lambs around the Islamic holidays, which happens to fit when we wean our lambs almost every year. And so he's buying from us and selling the end product, kind of a brokering situation. We do better on the meat side of things. So talked about quality and story. We've just started selling lambs to this guy. He's kind of a grumpy old guy, and a lot of people bring pretty scrawny, poor looking lambs to him. And we showed up with a trailer load of lambs that were in tip top shape. He was grumpy till I opened the trailer. And then he said, I'll actually give you a nickel more than what I told you I'd give you on the phone. And bring me more next year. Bring me whatever you can bring me next year. So that kind of story that goes with what we market applies to us as well as it did when we were selling at the farmer's market. Good question. Anything else? Any other online questions? See, economics can put you to sleep in a heartbeat.
We'll take a 5-minute break.
All right.
And we'll start up again with our roundtable.
Okay, great. Thank you guys very, very much. I hope this was useful. Nice to be in a new spot.